Fired without warning by her racist boss, Maya thought she'd lost everything. But fate had other plans. Months later, she returns to the same store, not as an employee, but as the new regional manager, ready to confront the man who underestimated her. The tables have turned. But before we begin, if you could have any superpower, what would it be? Tell us in the comments. Maya Andrews had always been a hard worker. From the time she was a young girl, she had learned that perseverance and dedication could get her far in life, even if the road ahead was full of obstacles. Now, at 26 years old, Maya found herself working long hours at a local retail store, a job that wasn't glamorous but paid the bills. She dreamed of moving up, of taking on more responsibility and eventually working in management. After all, Maya had big ambitions. She wanted to prove to herself, and to those who doubted her, that she was capable of more than just stocking shelves and assisting customers. Every day, Maya showed up early, ready to work. Her co-workers respected her, knowing that if anyone needed help or guidance, Maya was always there with a smile. Customers, too, appreciated her warmth and efficiency. To them, Maya was the heartbeat of the store, someone who made their shopping experience pleasant. But behind the scenes, things were different. There was a shadow hanging over her, a persistent cloud that made each day harder than the last. That shadow was her store manager, Greg. Greg had been the manager for as long as Maya had worked there, and from the beginning, it was clear that he wasn't a fan of hers. Greg was a man of rigid values, set in his ways, and not open to change. He had grown up in a different time, a different world, where people like Maya were expected to know their place. Though Greg rarely said anything outright racist, his actions spoke volumes. The subtle ways he ignored her ideas during staff meetings, the passive-aggressive comments he made about her attitude when she voiced a suggestion, and the way he micromanaged her every move, they all painted a clear picture. To Greg, Maya wasn't an employee with potential. She was a problem he was waiting to solve. Maya had always believed that if she worked hard enough, if she just kept her head down and did her job, she would eventually rise above it. She told herself that people like Greg would fade into the background, that her success would speak louder than his prejudice. But as the weeks passed, Greg's behavior worsened. He began assigning Maya the least desirable shifts, late nights, early mornings, weekends. He would critique her work in front of others, often finding fault where there was none. And yet, despite it all, Maya remained professional. She knew her worth, and she wasn't going to let one man's narrow view of the world define her. But then came the day that changed everything. It was a typical Thursday afternoon. The store was busy, customers flowing in and out, and Maya was stationed at the customer service desk, handling returns and answering questions. Her day had started like any other, with her arriving early and getting straight to work. She had just finished helping a particularly difficult customer when she saw Greg approaching from across the store, his face set in a hard line. Maya felt her stomach drop. She had grown accustomed to Greg's sour expressions, but today there was something different in his eyes, something colder. "Maya, I need to see you in my office," Greg said, his voice clipped. He didn't bother making eye contact. Maya nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She followed Greg through the maze of aisles and past the rows of stocked shelves, her mind racing. Had she done something wrong? Was this another one of Greg's attempts to undermine her? She knew she hadn't given him any legitimate reason to be upset, but that didn't stop the knot of anxiety from tightening in her chest. Once inside Greg's cramped office, he closed the door behind them and gestured for her to sit. Maya complied, her heart pounding in her ears. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating. Greg sat down across from her, folding his arms over his chest. "We've got a problem, Maya," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're just not fitting in here anymore. Your attitude is becoming a distraction. Customers have complained, and I've had multiple employees express concerns about working with you." Maya blinked, taken aback. She had never had a single complaint from a customer. In fact, she often received compliments on her service, and as for her co-workers, they all got along well with her. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but Greg cut her off before she could speak. "This isn't up for debate," Greg said, waving a dismissive hand. "I've made my decision. We're letting you go, effective immediately." The words hit Maya like a punch to the gut. Fired? Just like that? Her mind reeled. She had worked at the store for years, poured her energy into the job, always going above and beyond. And now, because of Greg's obvious bias, it was all being taken away from her in the blink of an eye. "I don't understand," Maya said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to remain calm. "What did I do wrong? I've always worked hard and followed the rules." Greg's face twisted into a sneer. "That's the problem, Maya. You think just because you work hard you're owed something. But you're not. This isn't your store and you're not the one in charge here. I am." Maya stared at him, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. She could feel the hot sting of tears threatening to spill over, but she refused to cry in front of Greg. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand tall even as the ground seemed to shift beneath her. "If that's your decision, then I'll leave," Maya said, her voice steady. "But just know this, Greg, you're wrong about me, and one day you'll see that." Greg didn't respond. He simply waved her out of his office, already moving on to whatever was next on his agenda. For him, firing Maya was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. For Maya, it felt like the end of the world. As she walked out of the store, her head held high despite the tears that burned in her eyes, Maya knew she couldn't give up. She couldn't let Greg win. She had worked too hard, come too far to let one man's narrow-mindedness derail her dreams. There had to be something better for her out there. A place where she could thrive, where her talent and work ethic would be recognized and valued. What Maya didn't know was that fate had something much bigger in store for her. A new chapter was about to begin, one that would take her places she had never imagined. And as for Greg, he had no idea that the woman he had just dismissed so casually would soon return, not as the employee he once belittled, but as someone with far more power than he could ever comprehend. The tables were about to turn, and when they did, Greg would find himself face to face with a truth he couldn't ignore. The consequences of his actions were coming, and Maya was about to show him just how wrong he had been. The moment Maya stepped outside the store, the weight of everything hit her. The cool afternoon air brushed against her skin, but it did little to soothe the heat of frustration and anger building inside her. She paused for a second, standing in the parking lot, unsure of what to do next. Her mind was spinning. Fired. Fired because of a man who couldn't see past her skin color. A man who had never respected her hard work or her dedication. How could everything she had worked so hard for be taken away in a single moment? Maya blinked rapidly, forcing back the tears that threatened to spill. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not now. She couldn't let Greg's prejudice and narrow-mindedness have that much power over her. But as she walked to her car, her body felt heavy, as if every step weighed 1,000 pounds. When she reached the driver's seat and closed the door, the floodgates opened. Hot tears ran down her face, and her chest heaved with the weight of the emotions she had tried so hard to hold in. For the first time in a long time, Maya allowed herself to feel everything. The hurt, the anger, the helplessness. She had been so close to getting somewhere in that job, to proving herself worthy of the management position she had dreamed about for so long. And now, all of that was gone in a flash, with no warning, no fair reason. She sat there for what felt like hours, the soft hum of traffic in the distance barely registering in her mind. Finally, she wiped her tears, took a deep breath, and pulled out her phone. There was only one person she wanted to talk to, her older sister, Jasmine. Jasmine had always been her rock, the one person she could count on when life got tough. If anyone could help her make sense of this situation, it was Jasmine. The phone rang only once before Jasmine picked up. "Maya, what's wrong?" Jasmine's voice was laced with concern, as though she could already sense the distress in her sister's silence. Maya struggled to get the words out. I got fired." "What?" Jasmine's tone sharpened immediately. "Fired? What happened? You've been working there for years." Maya exhaled shakily, trying to piece together the events. Greg. He fired me. He said I wasn't fitting in, that my attitude was a problem. But I swear, Jasmine, I didn't do anything wrong. I've always done my job, worked hard, showed up early, stayed late if I needed to. He just fired me. Jasmine was silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of what Maya was saying. Maya, that's not right. This isn't about your work, it's about Greg and his racism. We both know that. Maya felt a flicker of something deep inside her. Anger, yes, but also a renewed sense of resolve. I know it's because of that. But what do I do now? I can't just sit back and let this happen. I can't let him win. You won't, Jasmine replied firmly. You're stronger than this, and you're better than anything Greg could ever see in you. This is just a setback, Maya. You're going to come out of this stronger. Maya closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the seat, her sister's words washing over her like a balm. Jasmine was right. She was better than this. She had to be. But the question still remained. What now? As she hung up the phone, Maya sat in silence for a few minutes, thinking about her next steps. She couldn't afford to dwell on what had happened. The reality of losing her job was starting to settle in. Bills were piling up, rent was due, and her savings wouldn't last long. She had to figure out what came next. And fast. That night, Maya lay awake in her bed, her mind racing through every possible scenario. She knew she couldn't let this setback define her, but the fear of the unknown gnawed at her. What if she couldn't find another job? What if she couldn't pay her bills? The weight of those questions pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. In the days that followed, Maya threw herself into the job search. She updated her resume, applied to dozens of positions, and attended virtual interviews, all while trying to push thoughts of Greg and the injustice she had faced out of her mind. Each rejection email stung a little more, but Maya refused to give up. She knew she had to keep going. There had to be something better out there for her. One afternoon, as she was scrolling through job listings, she received a notification on LinkedIn. It was a message from an old acquaintance, Erica, someone she had met at a leadership conference a few years back. Erica had been a rising star in the corporate world, and they had kept in touch occasionally, exchanging updates on their careers. The message was simple. Hey Maya, I saw your post about looking for new opportunities. We have a management training program opening up at my company, and I thought of you. Let me know if you're interested. Maya's heart leapt as she read the message. Management training. The very thing she had been working towards for years. Could this be her chance? Without hesitation, she replied, expressing her interest. Within days, she was on a video call with Erica and the hiring team, discussing her experience and ambitions. As the interview progressed, Maya felt a spark of hope. She spoke passionately about her work ethic, her desire to grow in leadership, and her vision for making a positive impact in the workplace. The hiring team seemed impressed, nodding along as she spoke. By the end of the call, Maya could feel the excitement bubbling inside her. She had given it her all. A few days later, the email came. Congratulations! We are excited to offer you a spot in our management development program. Maya couldn't believe her eyes. She had done it. She had secured a place in a prestigious program that could elevate her career to heights she hadn't even imagined before. As Maya sat in her small apartment, reading the email over and over again, she felt something she hadn't felt since the day Greg fired her. Hope. This wasn't just a new job. It was a new beginning. A chance to rebuild herself, to rise above the adversity she had faced, and to prove once and for all that she was worth far more than Greg had ever given her credit for. But what Maya didn't know was that her journey wasn't just about her career. In the months to come, fate would bring her full circle back to the place where it all began, the store where Greg had humiliated her, the place where she had been dismissed and belittled. Only this time the power dynamic would be very different. Greg had no idea what was coming, and neither did Maya. The tables were about to turn, and when they did, everything would change. While Maya's world had been turned upside down, life at the store continued as if nothing had happened. Greg felt no remorse. He had, in his mind, made the right decision. As he sat in his office, the flicker of satisfaction in his chest hadn't diminished since that day. He believed that Maya's departure was necessary, that she had been nothing but trouble, a distraction in his perfectly run store. Greg Walker had been the manager of the store for almost a decade. He was proud of that fact. He'd worked his way up from a stock boy, earning every promotion with years of dedication and hard work. But Greg's definition of hard work had a clear, unspoken rule. Respect the hierarchy, don't challenge authority, and certainly don't expect special treatment. And in his mind, Maya had crossed that line repeatedly. For months he had watched her. That polite smile plastered on her face as if it made her better than everyone else. He couldn't quite place what it was about her that irked him so much. Perhaps it was the way she tried too hard, always putting in extra effort that, to him, seemed unnecessary. Maybe it was the fact that she had ideas that she thought were worth sharing during staff meetings, as though her opinions should hold any weight in his store. Greg leaned back in his worn office chair, glancing out through the small window that gave him a partial view of the sales floor. His employees moved like clockwork, stocking shelves, attending to customers, everything as it should be. Without Maya, it was quieter, calmer, less contentious, or so he told himself. He let out a breath and turned his attention back to his computer. The day's sales numbers were satisfactory, as usual. That's what mattered after all, keeping the store running efficiently. But as he stared at the screen, a thought lingered at the back of his mind, something he couldn't quite shake. Had Maya really been that much of a problem? He had fired employees before, underperformers, those who couldn't get along with others, those who just didn't fit. But firing Maya felt different. It wasn't her performance that had been the issue. She had been one of the best workers on the floor. Her customer service ratings were consistently high, and her co-workers respected her. Greg shook his head as if physically pushing the thoughts aside. She had an attitude. That was reason enough. She never fell in line the way the others did. She thought too much of herself, and Greg wasn't going to tolerate an employee who didn't know her place. He had given her every opportunity to be part of the team, and she had squandered it by acting like she was owed something more. Still, the doubt gnawed at him, creeping in despite his efforts to block it out. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his train of thought. It was an email notification, a memo from the corporate office reminding managers about the upcoming regional audits. Greg rolled his eyes. These audits were always a headache. The corporate auditors would visit each store to review performance metrics, management practices, and worst of all, employee satisfaction surveys. Greg hated the surveys. He didn't need a report to tell him how his employees felt about working in his store. He knew. They were fine. His store ran efficiently, and that was all the proof he needed. Yet something about this upcoming audit felt different. Corporate had been pushing for more diversity and inclusion training recently, rolling out new programs and initiatives that Greg found tedious. He had sat through countless webinars on unconscious bias and workplace equality, all while silently fuming. To him, it was a waste of time. His job was to manage a store, not play social worker. As he thought about the audit, the nagging feeling crept up again. Maya's firing. He knew she could have easily filed a complaint with HR, but it had been weeks now, and no such complaint had come. That at least gave him some relief. Still, the regional audit meant that some new corporate manager would likely come through his store, asking too many questions and poking around in things Greg didn't think were any of their business. His office door creaked open slightly, and Lisa, one of the store's assistant managers, poked her head in. "Hey, Greg, do you have a minute? There's a customer issue out front and I could use your help." Greg stood up, giving her a curt nod. "I'll handle it." He followed Lisa out of the office and into the bustle of the store, his eyes scanning the aisles, instantly slipping back into his role as the one in control. As they approached the front, he saw a customer gesturing angrily at the checkout clerk, their voice raised over a dispute about a coupon. Greg stepped in with his usual authority. diffusing the situation with a practiced smile and a calm explanation. The customer left, somewhat satisfied, and Greg turned to Lisa. "See, easy. Just a matter of being firm but polite. You need to take control of situations like that. Don't let customers walk all over you." Lisa nodded, though Greg could sense her unease. He had noticed a shift in the staff since Maya's firing. Lisa, in particular, seemed to be on edge more often than not, as if she were worried she might be the next in line to face Greg's wrath. But Greg didn't care. Running a store wasn't about making friends, and he didn't need his employees to like him. He needed them to do their jobs and follow his lead, nothing more. As the day wound down, Greg returned to his office, glancing once more at the memo about the audit. The regional manager overseeing the audits was someone new, a woman whose name he didn't recognize. M. Andrews. He clicked on the name to see if there was more information, but the details were vague. It didn't matter. Whoever this M. Andrews was, she was probably just another corporate type, fresh out of business school with little understanding of what it took to actually run a store. Greg shrugged off the thought and shut down his computer for the day. He didn't need to worry about some pencil pusher coming in to evaluate his store. He had done this job long enough to know how to play the game. He'd put on a show, answer the questions, and when it was all over, things would go right back to the way they had always been. As Greg grabbed his jacket and locked his office door, he couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. He had made his decision with Maya, and it was behind him now. His store was running smoothly again, and that was all that mattered. But what Greg didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that his world was about to be turned upside down. The upcoming audit wasn't just another routine check-in. The new regional manager, M. Andrews, wasn't just any corporate type. She was someone very familiar, someone he thought he had left in the past. But fate had other plans. In just a few days, Greg would find himself standing face to face with the very woman he had fired, and this time, she wouldn't be the one answering to him. No, this time the roles would be reversed. And when the tables turned, Greg would finally understand the weight of his actions. The reckoning was coming, and Maya was about to show him just how far she had come. The offer from Erica had been a lifeline for Maya. When she received the news that she had been accepted into the management development program, it was as though a weight had been lifted off her chest. After weeks of rejection emails and unanswered applications, Maya felt like she could breathe again. This was her opportunity, a chance not only to rebuild her career but to surpass the limits she had faced at her previous job. The training program was intense but exhilarating. Maya found herself immersed in lessons about leadership, corporate strategy, and effective communication. She thrived in the environment, quickly becoming one of the top candidates in the program. Her background in customer service, combined with her passion for improving the work environment, made her stand out among her peers. She absorbed everything like a sponge, and with each passing week, Maya felt herself becoming the leader she had always envisioned. The program wasn't just about learning how to run a store. It was about understanding how to lead people, how to build trust, and how to create a work culture where everyone felt valued. Maya had always believed in these principles, even back when she was a cashier trying to make a difference in her small ways. Now, she had the tools and knowledge to turn those beliefs into action. Maya wasn't just learning, she was thriving. Her instructors noticed, as did her fellow trainees. They admired her work ethic and her ability to remain calm under pressure. But what stood out most was her compassion. Maya wasn't the kind of leader who ruled with an iron fist. She led by example, always showing kindness and respect to those around her. It was a stark contrast to the leadership style she had experienced under Greg, and as she moved through the program, she became even more determined to ensure that no one under her supervision would ever feel the way Greg had made her feel. As the months went by, Maya's confidence grew. The sting of being fired from her previous job had faded, replaced by a sense of purpose and drive that carried her forward. Her instructors often pulled her aside to tell her how impressed they were with her progress, and it wasn't long before she started hearing whispers about her being fast-tracked for a leadership role. One day, near the end of the program, Maya's phone rang. It was Erica, her mentor, and the woman who had opened the door to this opportunity. "Maya, I have some exciting news," Erica said, her voice brimming with enthusiasm. "We've been watching your performance closely and the higher-ups are incredibly impressed. There's a regional manager position opening up soon, and I've recommended you for it." Maya's heart skipped a beat. A regional manager position? That was more than she had ever hoped for, especially so soon after finishing the program. "Regional manager?" Maya repeated, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. "Are you sure? I mean, I've just finished the training." "I'm sure," Erica replied. "You're ready for this, Maya. You've proven that you have the skills, the leadership, and the vision. I know you've only been here for a few months, but the kind of talent you have doesn't go unnoticed." Maya sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. She had gone from being fired and lost, unsure of her future, to being on the verge of a career breakthrough she had never even dreamed of. It felt surreal, but at the same time she knew she had earned it. All those long hours studying, all the extra effort she put into her work, it had paid off. She had proven to herself that she was more than capable of succeeding in management. "There's just one thing," Erica continued, breaking into Maya's thoughts. "The region you'd be overseeing includes several stores in the area you used to work in." Maya froze. The words hung in the air between them. The area she used to work in. The realization hit her like a wave. The store where she had been fired, where Greg had humiliated her, was part of the region she would now be managing. Her mind raced. Could she really go back? Could she face Greg again, knowing what had happened? And not just face him, but oversee him. The thought filled her with a mix of emotions, nervousness, anticipation, and maybe, just maybe, a sense of satisfaction. She had worked so hard to prove herself, and now she would be walking back into that store as his superior. The tables had turned in a way that she could never have predicted. "Maya?" Erica's voice pulled her back to the present. "Are you okay with that? I know it might be a bit awkward considering your history there." Maya took a deep breath. "I'm more than okay with it," she said, her voice steady. "In fact, I think it's exactly what I need to do." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Erica responded. "I had a feeling you'd say that. You've always been resilient, Maya. That's one of the reasons I know you'll succeed in this role." Maya hung up the phone and sat in silence for a moment, letting everything sink in. She was going back to the store where she had been cast aside, but this time she was going with her head held high, with the power to make real changes. It wasn't about revenge. Maya didn't believe in that. It was about redemption, about showing that no matter what Greg had thought of her, no matter how he had underestimated her, she was capable of so much more. A week later, Maya stood in front of the mirror in her apartment, adjusting the blazer she had chosen for her first day as regional manager. She had worked hard to get to this point, and today, she was going to walk into that store not as a fired employee but as a leader. As she drove toward the store, a flood of memories washed over her. She remembered the way Greg had looked at her with disdain, the way he had dismissed her efforts, and how he had treated her as if she didn't belong. But now, things were different. She belonged here, more than ever. She had earned this position, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. When Maya pulled into the parking lot, she took a deep breath. The store looked exactly the same from the outside. Nothing had changed in the months since she had left, but as she walked through the automatic doors, something in the air felt different. She wasn't the same person who had walked out of those doors months ago. She was stronger now, more confident. She knew her worth, and she wasn't afraid to show it. Maya could feel the eyes of the staff on her as she entered. Some of them recognized her, their expressions a mix of surprise and curiosity, but she didn't focus on them. Her attention was drawn to the back of the store, where the manager's office stood. Greg's office. He had no idea what was coming. The store buzzed with the usual afternoon activity, customers browsing the aisles, cashiers ringing up purchases, and the faint hum of background music filling the space. Maya stood just inside the entrance, allowing herself a brief moment to take it all in. It was surreal to be back here, but this time things were different. She wasn't just an employee anymore. She was in charge. As she walked further into the store, her heels clicking softly against the tile floor, a few employees glanced her way, some with recognition, others with confusion. There were familiar faces, people she had worked alongside during her time here, but there were new ones as well. For a moment, she wondered what they would think of her now, knowing she had once stood where they were. But that thought quickly passed. It didn't matter. What mattered now was the task at hand, transforming this store, its culture, and the way it was managed. Her eyes moved toward the back of the store, toward the small, windowless office that had once been the site of her greatest humiliation. Greg's office. Maya felt her heart quicken as she thought about what was coming. Greg didn't know she was here, and he certainly didn't know that she was now his boss. But that would change soon. Maya made her way to the front desk, where the assistant manager, Lisa, was busy sorting through a stack of papers. When she looked up and saw Maya, her eyes widened in surprise. "Maya?" Lisa's voice was a mix of disbelief and confusion. I didn't know you were coming back." Maya gave her a small smile, trying to ease the tension she could already feel building in the air. "I'm not coming back as an employee, Lisa. I'm the new regional manager. I'll be overseeing this store, among others." The shock on Lisa's face was palpable. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she were about to say something, but then closed again, the weight of the news sinking in. Maya could see the gears turning in her mind, likely piecing together the implications of what this meant for Greg and the rest of the team. "Regional manager?" Lisa finally managed to say. "Wow, that's amazing, Maya. I had no idea." She blinked a few times, trying to recover. "So, you're here for the audit?" Maya nodded. "That's right. I'll be conducting a full review of the store's operations, management practices, and employee satisfaction. I'm here to make sure things are running smoothly." The color seemed to drain from Lisa's face as she processed the information. Maya could tell that Lisa was torn between being happy for her former colleague and the fear of what Greg would say or do once he found out. After all, Greg had a reputation for being controlling and resistant to change. Before Lisa could respond, Maya heard the familiar creak of a door opening behind her. She turned just in time to see Greg step out of his office, completely oblivious to the tension building around him. He glanced at Lisa as if to check on her progress, but his eyes quickly shifted to Maya. For a split second, his expression was unreadable. Confusion, maybe. Annoyance, definitely. And then, something else. A flicker of recognition. It was clear that he hadn't expected to see her again. "Maya!" Greg's voice was laced with surprise and a hint of condescension. He glanced at Lisa before turning his attention back to Maya. "What are you doing here? Did you forget something?" Maya resisted the urge to laugh. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. Greg still saw her as the employee he had fired months ago, the woman he had dismissed as not fitting in. He had no idea that she now held the authority to change everything. "I didn't forget anything, Greg," Maya said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here for a different reason. I'm your new regional manager." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, the entire store seemed to freeze. Greg's face paled as he processed what she had just said. His eyes widened, darting between Maya and Lisa, as if searching for some explanation. But there was none. The truth was right in front of him. "Our regional manager?" Greg stammered, clearly taken aback. "But how, when?" Maya met his gaze, her expression steady. "I was promoted after completing a management training program. I'm responsible for overseeing this store and several others in the region now." Greg's mouth opened, then closed, as if he were struggling to form a coherent response. Maya could see the disbelief in his eyes. This wasn't how things were supposed to go, not in his world. In his mind, Maya was supposed to fade away after he fired her, to disappear into the background like so many others before her. But here she was, standing before him, not as the woman he had dismissed, but as his superior. "Well," Greg finally managed, his voice tight, "this is unexpected." Maya couldn't help but notice the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched at his sides as though he were trying to maintain control. It was clear that he didn't know how to react. He had spent years in this store, ruling over his employees with a firm hand, believing that he was untouchable. Now, everything had shifted, and the power dynamic had flipped completely. "I'm here to conduct an audit of the store," Maya said, keeping her tone professional. "I'll be reviewing your management practices as well as speaking with the employees about their experiences working here. This is standard protocol for all the stores in the region." Greg swallowed hard, the color still drained from his face. "Of course," he muttered. We're running things smoothly here. There shouldn't be any issues." Maya held his gaze for a moment, letting the weight of her presence sink in. She knew what Greg was thinking. He was scrambling, trying to figure out how to salvage his reputation now that she was in charge. But Maya wasn't interested in playing his games. She had come here with a purpose, to make real changes to ensure that the store was a place where all employees were treated fairly, regardless of their background. "I hope so, Greg," Maya replied. "I'll be speaking with each department individually, and I expect full cooperation." Greg nodded stiffly, his eyes flicking nervously toward Lisa before settling back on Maya. He looked as though he wanted to say more, to explain away his behavior, but he stayed silent. There was nothing he could say that would change the reality of the situation. As Maya moved past him, heading toward the employee break room to begin her audit, she felt a surge of confidence. This was her moment, the culmination of all her hard work. And while she didn't need Greg's validation, the look on his face, the shock, the confusion, the fear, was something she would remember for a long time. It wasn't about revenge. It never had been. Maya had come here to make things right, not to settle old scores, but the irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. The man who had once held her fate in his hands was now the one facing an uncertain future. The tables had turned, and Maya was ready to take control. What Greg didn't know was that this was just the beginning. The changes Maya planned to implement would go far beyond him. She was here to reshape the entire culture of the store, to ensure that no one would ever have to go through what she had experienced. And as she began the audit, speaking with employees and reviewing the store's practices, she knew one thing for certain. This was her store now. Greg sat at his desk, staring blankly at the stack of papers in front of him. He couldn't concentrate. He couldn't think straight. His mind kept replaying the moment when Maya had introduced herself as his new regional manager, her voice calm and composed while he stood there speechless. The shock hadn't worn off, and now, sitting alone in his office, the reality of the situation started to settle in. How had this happened? For years, Greg had prided himself on maintaining control over his store, his employees, and his environment. He had believed with unwavering certainty that his authority was absolute. No one questioned his decisions, least of all Maya, whom he had written off as a problem. And yet here she was, the woman he had fired without a second thought, back in the store. And not just back, but above him, in charge of everything. The irony gnawed at him, twisting like a knife in his gut. Maya had changed. She wasn't the same woman he had dismissed months ago. There was a confidence in her now, a quiet power that unnerved him. Greg wasn't used to feeling powerless, but today, that's exactly what he felt. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, tapping his fingers anxiously on the desk. How could this be happening? How could someone like her, someone he had fired, come back to be his boss? His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. He had seen people move up in the company before, but never like this. Never someone who had been in a position like hers. Maya had always been a solid worker, sure, but in Greg's eyes, she was never anything more than that, a worker. And yet here she was in a position that Greg had only ever dreamed of reaching. There was a knock at the door, pulling Greg from his spiraling thoughts. He sat up straight, clearing his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Come in," he called out, his voice gruffer than intended. The door creaked open, and Maya stepped inside. She carried a clipboard with her, her demeanor professional but cool. Greg's stomach tightened at the sight of her. He had no idea what she was going to say, or how she would handle this sudden power shift. He could feel the weight of her authority pressing down on him, and it was a feeling he despised. "Maya," Greg said, forcing a smile. "Or should I say, Ms. Andrews?" He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Have a seat." Maya didn't sit. She stood tall, her gaze steady and unflinching. "I'm here to review the store's management practices, Greg. It's part of the audit process." Greg felt a cold sweat forming at the back of his neck. He had known the audit was coming, of course, but he had never expected to be on the receiving end of Maya's scrutiny. He swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "Of course," he said, his voice strained. "Whatever you need." Maya glanced down at the clipboard in her hand, flipping through the pages with practiced precision. "I've already spoken with several of the employees," she said, her tone even. "I'm gathering feedback on the overall work environment, and I'll be making recommendations based on what I find." Greg's heart sank. He knew what this meant. The employees were talking about him, about how he ran the store, about every decision he had made. They had always followed his lead before. What were they saying now that Maya was in charge? "And what kind of feedback are you getting?" Greg asked, trying to sound casual, though his hands gripped the edge of his desk tightly. Maya's eyes met his, her expression unreadable. "I've heard a variety of comments," she said, "but what I'm most concerned about is the way management interacts with the staff. There seems to be a pattern of employees feeling undervalued and unsupported. I'm sure you're aware of the importance of a positive work environment." Greg shifted in his seat, his throat dry. "Of course. I run a tight ship here, Maya, Ms. Andrews. I make sure things get done." Maya raised an eyebrow, her gaze unwavering. "There's more to managing people than making sure things get done, Greg. It's about leadership. It's about fostering an environment where employees feel respected and empowered. If the staff doesn't feel valued, they won't be motivated to perform at their best." Her words cut through the room, each one landing heavily in the silence that followed. Greg wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he couldn't find the words. Deep down, he knew there was truth in what she was saying. For years, he had ruled the store with an iron fist, believing that control was the key to success. But now, with Maya standing in front of him, he realized how fragile that control had been all along. Maya continued, her voice calm but firm. "One of the main concerns I've heard is a lack of open communication between management and employees. People don't feel like they have a voice here. That needs to change." Greg clenched his jaw, feeling the frustration bubbling up inside him. "I've always been fair," he muttered. "I treat everyone the same." Maya didn't waver. "That's part of the problem, Greg. Treating everyone the same doesn't account for individual needs and differences. A good leader understands that people need different kinds of support." Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Greg had never taken the time to consider his employees as individuals with different needs. To him, they were cogs in a machine, interchangeable, replaceable. And now, as he sat in front of Maya, it was clear that his way of thinking had caught up with him. Greg felt a knot forming in his chest, the weight of his past decisions pressing down on him. For the first time, he truly felt the consequences of his actions. He had spent so much time trying to maintain control that he had lost sight of what it meant to be a leader. Maya glanced down at her clipboard again, then back up at Greg. "There's another issue we need to address," she said, her tone more serious. "The circumstances of my termination." Greg's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment he had been dreading since Maya walked back through the doors of the store. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his pulse quickening. I don't know what you mean," he stammered, though he knew exactly what she meant. Maya's eyes narrowed slightly, but her expression remained calm. "When I was fired, I wasn't given a valid reason. The accusations you made against me, about my attitude and performance, weren't substantiated. You didn't follow company protocol when it came to handling employee disputes." Greg opened his mouth to speak, but Maya didn't give him the chance. I've reviewed the records, Greg, and I know that my termination was not based on performance issues. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Greg felt trapped, cornered by the truth that he had tried so hard to bury. Look, Maya, Greg began, but his voice faltered. He couldn't lie his way out of this one. He knew that. Maya had all the evidence she needed, and there was no denying the truth. Maya took a step closer, her gaze piercing. "I've moved past it," she said quietly. "I didn't come back here for revenge. But I need you to understand that the way you treated me, and the way you've treated others, is not acceptable. Things are going to change in this store." Greg swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he had never felt before. The power he had once held was gone, and there was no getting it back. All he could do now was face the consequences of his actions. Maya straightened, her professional demeanor unwavering. "I'll be submitting my report to corporate," she said. "They'll decide the next steps. In the meantime, I expect full cooperation with the rest of the audit." Greg could only nod, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. As Maya turned to leave the office, Greg sat in stunned silence, his mind racing with the realization that his world had been turned upside down. The truth had finally caught up with him, and there was no escaping it. As the day went on, Maya continued her audit, speaking with employees from different departments. The feedback she gathered was not surprising, but it was disheartening. Time and again, she heard the same things. Employees felt micromanaged, unappreciated, and fearful of making mistakes. They didn't feel like they had a voice, and many admitted to staying quiet about their concerns out of fear of retaliation. It was a difficult atmosphere to thrive in, one that Maya knew all too well. She had lived it herself, endured it under Greg's leadership, but now she had the power to change it, and she would. As the afternoon wore on, Maya found herself in front of Greg's office once again. This time she didn't knock. She opened the door and stepped inside, finding Greg sitting at his desk, staring at his computer screen. His shoulders were tense, and the look on his face told her everything she needed to know. He was dreading this moment. Greg glanced up, startled by her sudden entrance. He quickly masked his surprise with a forced smile, but Maya could see the nervousness in his eyes. "Ms. Andrews," Greg said, his voice tight, "I wasn't expecting you." Maya closed the door behind her and walked to the center of the room. She didn't sit down. This was not a casual conversation. She was here to address what had been left unsaid for too long. "We need to have a serious conversation, Greg," Maya began, her tone calm but firm. "About my termination, and about the way you've been managing this store." Greg swallowed hard, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "Look, Maya," he began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I know things didn't end well between us when you worked here, but that was a long time ago. I thought we'd moved on from that." Maya didn't flinch. "Moved on? Greg, what happened to me wasn't just a bad memory. It was a blatant abuse of power, and it wasn't an isolated incident. I've spoken to the employees here, and it's clear that the toxic culture you created still exists." Greg's face reddened slightly, and he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I don't know what you're talking about," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I've always done what's best for this store." "What's best for the store?" Maya repeated, her voice rising slightly. "You fired me because you couldn't handle the fact that I was good at my job, and because I didn't fall in line with your narrow view of how things should be run. You tried to keep me down, and when that didn't work, you got rid of me." Greg opened his mouth to protest, but Maya didn't give him the chance. "I've spoken to nearly every employee in this store," she continued, "and their stories are the same. They feel intimidated, undervalued, and afraid to speak up. That's not leadership, Greg. That's control, and it's not going to happen anymore." Greg's jaw tightened, and for a moment Maya thought he might argue with her, but instead, he slumped back in his chair, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy fog. I didn't realize," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I was just trying to keep things running smoothly. I didn't mean to— To what? Maya interrupted, her voice sharp. To create an environment where people are too afraid to speak their minds? To make people feel like they don't matter? Because that's exactly what you've done, Greg. Greg's shoulders sagged, and for the first time Maya saw something in his eyes that looked like genuine regret. But she wasn't here for an apology. She wasn't here to make Greg feel better about his mistakes. She was here to hold him accountable. When you fired me, Maya said quietly, you didn't just take away my job. You made me feel like I didn't belong, like I wasn't good enough. And I know I'm not the only one who's felt that way under your leadership. Greg looked away, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. I didn't mean for that to happen, he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. I thought I was doing the right thing. Maya let out a slow breath, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. You thought wrong, Greg, and now you have to face the consequences. Greg's head snapped up, his eyes wide with fear. Consequences? He repeated. What do you mean? Maya took a step closer to his desk, her gaze steady. I've already submitted my preliminary report to corporate, she said. They're going to conduct a full review of your management practices, and they'll make a decision about what happens next. Greg paled, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the desk tighter. But I can change, he stammered. I can fix this. Please, Maya, don't ruin my career over this. Maya felt a flicker of sympathy, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of how he had treated her, how he had treated so many others. This wasn't about ruining anyone's career. It was about doing what was right. I'm not here to ruin your career, Greg, she said quietly. I'm here to make sure this store becomes a better place to work. You've had your chance to lead, and you failed. Now it's up to corporate to decide what happens next. Greg slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. I didn't mean for it to get this bad, he whispered, more to himself than to Maya. Maya watched him for a moment, her emotions swirling inside her. She had dreamed of this moment, the moment when Greg would finally face the consequences of his actions. But now that it was here, it didn't feel as satisfying as she had imagined. There was no triumph in seeing someone brought low, no victory in watching Greg crumble under the weight of his own mistakes. This wasn't about revenge, it never had been. It was about accountability, about making sure that the people who came after her wouldn't have to go through what she had experienced. Maya took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. You have the opportunity to learn from this, Greg, she said, her voice softer now. But that's up to you. If you really want to change, you need to start by acknowledging your mistakes and listening to the people around you. Greg didn't respond. He sat there, hunched over his desk as though the weight of the world had finally settled on his shoulders. Maya watched him for a moment longer, then turned and headed for the door. As she reached for the handle, Greg's voice stopped her. Maya, he said quietly, his voice strained. I'm sorry. Maya paused, her hand hovering over the door handle. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. Greg's apology, while unexpected, wasn't what she had come for. She had come to make things right, not to seek personal retribution. Without another word, Maya opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The conversation was over, but the changes that needed to happen were only just beginning. The days following Maya's confrontation with Greg were a whirlwind. Corporate had received Maya's report, and the review process had officially begun. Greg's world, once so stable and predictable, was now unraveling before his eyes. He could no longer hide behind the facade of authority and control that had shielded him for so long. For the first time in his career, Greg was forced to face the reality of his actions and the consequences they had on the people around him. As much as Greg tried to maintain his composure in front of the staff, it was clear to everyone that something had changed. His once confident stride had slowed, and the edge of arrogance that had always accompanied his interactions with employees seemed to have dulled. The employees noticed it too. There was a palpable shift in the store's atmosphere, an uncertainty that lingered in the air, like everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. But the changes weren't just in Greg's demeanor. After the conversation with Maya, he had been left with a bitter truth he could no longer ignore. The leadership style he had prided himself on for years had failed. He hadn't been a leader, he had been a tyrant. The realization hit him harder than anything he had ever experienced in his professional life. In the days that followed, Greg found himself reflecting on everything. He had spent years believing that his methods were what kept the store running smoothly. He had convinced himself that being tough, demanding, and often dismissive was just part of the job. But now, with Maya's words echoing in his mind and the threat of losing everything looming over him, Greg could see the cracks in the foundation of everything he had built. One afternoon, as he sat alone in his office, Greg picked up the employee feedback reports Maya had compiled. He had been avoiding them, not wanting to confront the harsh truth that lay within those pages. But there was no more running from it. Slowly, he began to flip through the pages, reading the comments that his employees had submitted. "I feel like my work goes unnoticed. There's no room for growth here. It's like no one cares about what we want or need. I don't feel comfortable speaking up. I've seen what happens when people try to suggest changes." The comments went on, each one a painful reminder of how far he had strayed from being the kind of leader he thought he was. Greg's stomach churned as he read the feedback. It was as if the employees had been holding their breath, waiting for a chance to speak their truth. And now, with Maya leading the charge, they finally had the opportunity. He put the papers down, his hands trembling slightly. The walls of his office, once a symbol of his control, now felt suffocating. Greg stood up abruptly, feeling the need to escape the confines of the room. He needed to think, to clear his head, to figure out what was next. Without saying a word to anyone, Greg left the store and walked down the street. His mind was racing with thoughts of the audit, of Maya, of all the people he had mistreated over the years. What if corporate decided to fire him? What if this was the end of his career? The questions gnawed at him, but underneath the fear was something else, something unfamiliar. Regret. Greg had never considered himself a man prone to reflection. He had always been too busy running the store, keeping things in order, making sure the numbers looked good. But now, as he walked aimlessly through the streets, he couldn't stop thinking about the people he had let down, the opportunities he had missed to be a better leader. For years, he had viewed his employees as tools to get the job done, not as individuals with their own goals, dreams, and needs. He had dismissed their concerns, belittled their efforts, and created a culture of fear. And for what? To keep the store running smoothly? To maintain his authority? Greg shook his head, feeling the weight of his failures settle over him like a heavy cloak. He found himself at a small park, the sound of children playing in the distance cutting through his thoughts. Greg sat on a bench, staring out at the scene before him. He had spent so much of his life focused on climbing the corporate ladder, on proving himself to be the best, that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. Leadership wasn't about control. It wasn't about making people fear you. It was about lifting others up, about creating an environment where people felt valued, respected, and empowered. And he had failed. Greg sat there for what felt like hours, lost in thought. For the first time, he was truly reflecting on the man he had become, the choices he had made, and the impact those choices had on others. It wasn't a pleasant realization, but it was necessary. Maya had been right. He needed to change, not just for the sake of his career, but for himself. The next day, Greg returned to the store with a newfound resolve. He didn't know if corporate would let him keep his job, but he knew that if he did, things would be different. He couldn't undo the mistakes he had made, but he could try to make amends. He could start by listening. He called a meeting with the staff, something he rarely did outside of routine updates or reprimands. The employees gathered in the break room, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. They knew something was happening, but no one knew what to expect from Greg. When he stood in front of them, Greg felt the weight of their eyes on him. He cleared his throat, his voice unsteady at first. "I know things haven't been easy around here," Greg began, his voice softer than usual. "And I know a lot of that is because of me." A murmur went through the room, but no one interrupted. Greg took a deep breath and continued. I've spent a lot of time thinking about the way I've managed this store, and I've come to realize that I haven't been the kind of leader you all deserve. I've made mistakes, and I've created an environment where people feel like they can't speak up. For that, I'm sorry. The room was silent, the employees watching him with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. Greg had never apologized to anyone before, and the admission felt both uncomfortable and liberating. I want to do better, Greg said, his gaze sweeping the room. I want to create a place where everyone feels like they're heard, where you feel like your work matters. I can't change the past, but I'm committed to changing how we move forward. I'll be working closely with Maya and corporate to make sure we address the issues that have been brought up. And if any of you have concerns or suggestions, my door is open. For a moment, no one spoke. Greg could feel the tension in the room, the uncertainty. But then, one of the employees, Sarah, a cashier who had worked at the store for years, raised her hand. I appreciate you saying that, Greg, Sarah said quietly. But we've heard promises before. How do we know this time will be different? Greg nodded, the question hitting him like a punch to the gut. He had expected it, and she was right to ask. I can't ask you to trust me just based on words, Greg replied honestly, but I'm asking for the chance to prove it through my actions. Sarah nodded, and Greg could see the wheels turning in the minds of the other employees. They weren't convinced yet, and he didn't blame them. Trust would take time, and Greg was willing to put in the effort. As the meeting wrapped up, Greg felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that for the first time in years, he was on the right path. In the weeks that followed Greg's apology and his commitment to change, the atmosphere in the store began to shift. It wasn't an overnight transformation. Trust takes time to rebuild. But there was a noticeable difference. The employees, once fearful of speaking up, started to approach Greg with their concerns, ideas, and suggestions. Greg made a conscious effort to listen, really listen to what they had to say. He realized that leadership wasn't just about issuing orders and ensuring compliance. It was about creating a space where people felt valued, where they felt like their voices mattered. Greg took small, deliberate steps to change the way he managed the store. Instead of dictating every decision, he began involving the employees in the process. He held regular team meetings where everyone had the opportunity to share their thoughts and contribute to the store's operations. He encouraged collaboration and started to recognize the unique strengths of each person on his team. For the first time, Greg realized how much talent and potential had been wasted under his old management style. Employees like Sarah, who had been with the store for years, had ideas for improving customer service that Greg had never considered. Others, like Lisa, the assistant manager, had suggestions for streamlining the store's inventory process that made operations more efficient. Greg had always thought of himself as the only person who could solve problems, but now he saw that the solutions had been right in front of him all along. He just hadn't been willing to listen. It wasn't easy for Greg. There were days when he fell back into old habits, days when his instinct was to take control and issue commands rather than seek input. But each time he felt himself slipping, he remembered Maya's words. There's more to managing people than making sure things get done. It had become his mantra, a reminder that leadership was about more than just results. It was about people. Maya, meanwhile, had kept a close eye on Greg's progress. She didn't interfere with his management, but she was always there, checking in with the employees and ensuring that the changes Greg had promised were being implemented. At first, the employees were cautious around her, unsure of what her role in the store would be now that she was in a position of power. But Maya quickly put their fears to rest. She wasn't there to micromanage Greg or to dictate how things should be run. She was there to ensure that the store became a place where everyone, Greg included, could grow and succeed. One afternoon, as Maya was conducting one of her routine check-ins, she noticed Greg standing in the middle of the sales floor, talking with a group of employees. He wasn't barking orders or giving them instructions. He was asking questions, listening to their feedback, and taking notes. It was a far cry from the man who had once ruled the store with an iron fist, and Maya couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Greg was learning. He was changing. And while he still had a long way to go, the progress he had made was undeniable. Later that day, Greg approached Maya in the break room. He looked nervous, but there was a determination in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Maya, can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, his voice steady. Maya nodded, motioning for him to sit across from her. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Greg hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. The audit, the feedback from the employees, the way I used to run things." He paused, looking down at his hands. "I know I've made mistakes, big ones, and I've been trying to make up for that, but I still feel like there's more I need to do." Maya watched him carefully, sensing that he was struggling to find the right words. She waited patiently, giving him the space he needed to continue. "I want to be better," Greg said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for the store, but for myself. I've spent so much of my career thinking that leadership was about control, about making people fall in line. But I see now that I was wrong. I need to change, and I want your help." Maya was quiet for a moment, letting his words sink in. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine desire to grow and improve. It wasn't just about keeping his job anymore. It was about becoming the kind of leader he had never been. "I appreciate your honesty, Greg," Maya said softly. "It takes a lot of courage to admit when you've made mistakes. And you're right, there's always room for growth. The fact that you're willing to learn is a big step." Greg nodded, relief washing over his face. "I know I can't undo what's been done, but I want to make sure that moving forward, things are different." Maya leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. "You've already started making changes, Greg. The employees have noticed and they appreciate it. But leadership isn't a destination, it's a journey. It takes constant effort, reflection, and a willingness to adapt. You've come a long way, but there's still work to be done." Greg nodded again, his eyes steady. "I'm ready for that work." From that moment on, Greg became even more committed to his personal growth and to transforming the store's culture. He enrolled in leadership training programs, attended workshops on diversity and inclusion, and sought out mentorship from experienced leaders who could guide him on his journey. It wasn't about checking boxes or satisfying corporate requirements. It was about becoming the kind of leader who inspired, rather than intimidated, his team. Maya, too, found herself reflecting on her own journey. She had come so far from the days when she had worked under Greg, feeling powerless and dismissed. Now she was in a position to influence not just one store, but an entire region of stores. The responsibility weighed heavily on her, but it was a weight she carried with pride. She knew that her role was about more than just ensuring profitability. It was about creating environments where people could thrive, where their voices were heard, and where they felt valued. As the months passed, the store continued to improve. Employee morale was higher than it had been in years, and the once tense atmosphere had been replaced with a sense of collaboration and mutual respect. Greg had earned back some of the trust he had lost, not through words but through consistent actions. He wasn't perfect and there were still moments when he stumbled, but the employees could see that he was genuinely trying. And in the end, that's what mattered. Several months later, the transformation was complete. The store, once a place of tension and fear, had become a model of positive leadership and teamwork. Corporate had taken notice of the changes and had praised both Maya and Greg for their efforts in turning things around. The store's performance had improved, customer satisfaction was at an all-time high, and employee turnover had significantly decreased. But the real success wasn't measured in numbers or corporate accolades. It was in the sense of pride and ownership that the employees now felt. They had a voice, and they knew it. They were part of a team that valued their contributions, and they took pride in the work they did. And at the center of it all was Greg, a man who had gone from being a symbol of fear to a symbol of redemption. It hadn't been easy. but Greg had earned back the respect of his team. He had learned that leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about being the one who listened the most. He had become the kind of manager who asked for feedback, who welcomed new ideas, and who supported his employees in their personal and professional growth. One afternoon, as the store was winding down after a particularly busy day, Maya walked through the aisles, taking in the sights and sounds of the bustling store. She couldn't help but smile at how far things had come. It was hard to believe that just a year ago, this had been a place where employees were afraid to speak up, where they had felt stifled and undervalued. Now, it was thriving, a testament to what could happen when people were given the chance to lead with compassion and understanding. Maya made her way to Greg's office, where she found him sitting at his desk, reviewing the day's sales reports. He looked up when she entered, a smile crossing his face. "Maya," he said, standing up to greet her. "Good to see you." "You too, Greg," Maya replied, taking a seat across from him. "I just wanted to check in and see how things were going." Greg leaned back in his chair, a look of contentment on his face. "Things are going well," he said. "Really well, actually. The team is more engaged than ever, and the changes we've made are paying off." Maya nodded, her eyes scanning the room. It was still the same office where Greg had once fired her, but now it felt different. It wasn't a place of conflict anymore. It was a place of growth and opportunity. "You've done a great job, Greg," Maya said, her voice sincere. "I know it wasn't easy, but you've really turned things around." Greg smiled, but there was a humility in his expression that hadn't been there before. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted. "You showed me a different way of leading, and I'll always be grateful for that." Maya felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was a moment of closure, not just for her, but for both of them. They had come full circle, from adversaries to colleagues who respected and supported each other. It wasn't the journey she had expected, but it was one she was proud to have been a part of. As Maya stood to leave, Greg stopped her. "Maya," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion, "I just want to say thank you, not just for helping me keep my job, but for helping me become a better leader." Maya smiled, her heart full. "You're welcome, Greg. And thank you for being willing to change." With that, Maya left the office, walking through the store one last time before heading home. As she stepped out into the evening air, she felt a sense of peace and accomplishment. The road hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And in the end, that's what leadership was all about. Helping others grow, even when the path was difficult. It was about creating a legacy of change, one that would last long after the challenges had passed. Maya's journey from being wrongfully fired to becoming the regional manager is a testament to resilience, strength, and the power of leadership through empathy. By confronting Greg, she not only holds him accountable, but also sparks his transformation. Greg, once driven by control and prejudice, learns to value his employees and adopt a leadership style based on respect and collaboration. Together, their story illustrates how even the most toxic environments can change when both humility and personal growth are embraced.